The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned. Nigel Farage rose from his seat with that knowing smirk, the one that says he's been waiting for exactly this moment. Keir Starmer, mid-sentence, froze. You could feel it. Something devastating was about to drop. And when Farage opened his mouth, what came next wasn't just a question. It was a political grenade with the pin already pulled. This wasn't scheduled. This wasn't planned. This was an ambush in broad daylight, and Starmer had nowhere to run. Parliament has seen its share of dramatic moments, but what unfolded on this particular afternoon will be replayed in political circles for years to come. The Prime Minister stood at the dispatch box delivering what seemed like a routine response to questions about government policy. His tone was measured, his words carefully crafted by advisors who probably spent hours ensuring every syllable was defensible. Starmer has always prided himself on his prosecutorial background, his ability to dissect arguments and present facts with clinical precision. He came from the courtroom, where preparation is everything, where you control the narrative by controlling the evidence. But Parliament isn't a courtroom, and Nigel Farage isn't a witness you can cross-examine into submission. Farage had been unusually quiet that day. While other MPs traded barbs and talking points, he sat there, arms folded, watching. Anyone who knows Farage knows that silence from him is never a good sign. It's not peace. It's the calm before the storm. He was studying Starmer, watching him settle into a rhythm, waiting for the exact moment when the Prime Minister would feel most comfortable, most confident. Because that's when you strike. That's when the impact is greatest. Farage has built his entire political career on timing. Brexit didn't happen because he had the best arguments, though he'd claim he did. It happened because he knew exactly when to push, when to provoke, when to force the establishment into corners they couldn't escape from. The question came out of nowhere. Starmer was discussing economic forecasts, rattling off statistics about growth and employment, the kind of numbers that sound impressive in isolation but mean little without context. He was in his element, or so he thought. Then Farage stood. The murmur in the chamber shifted. MPs on both sides leaned forward. Even the speaker seemed to tense up as if sensing what was coming. Farage didn't need notes. He didn't need to check facts with an aide. He looked directly at Starmer and asked about the one thing the Prime Minister had been desperately trying to avoid, the immigration figures that had just been leaked that morning. Not the official figures, not the sanitised numbers that would eventually appear in government reports with favourable framing, the real numbers. The ones showing that despite every promise, despite every tough-talking speech about controlling borders, the figures had actually increased dramatically. And Farage had them, every single digit. He recited them slowly, deliberately, giving each number time to land, time to sink into the consciousness of everyone watching. Starmer's expression changed. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening of the shoulders. But it was there. He knew he'd been caught. The beauty of Farage's approach was its simplicity. He didn't editorialise. He didn't need to make grand accusations or throw insults. He simply presented the numbers and asked a straightforward question. Prime Minister, you told the British people you would reduce immigration. These figures, released just hours ago, show the opposite. Can you explain to this House, and more importantly to the millions watching, why they should believe anything you say about immigration ever again? The chamber erupted, not with cheers or jeers, but with that particular kind of chaos that happens when everyone knows something significant has just occurred. Opposition MPs smelled blood. Government backbenchers looked at each other nervously, and Starmer stood there, forced to respond to a question he absolutely did not want to answer. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about credibility. Starmer had built his leadership on being the serious alternative, the steady hand, the man who wouldn't make promises he couldn't keep. He'd spent months criticising his predecessors for exactly this kind of failure, promising one thing and delivering another. He'd made immigration control a centrepiece of his appeal to traditional Labour voters who drifted toward Reform UK, toward Farage's message. He'd looked directly into cameras and said things would be different under his watch. And now, Confronted with evidence that nothing had changed, that if anything, things had gotten worse, he had seconds to formulate a response that wouldn't destroy everything he'd built. Farage remained standing, arms crossed again, that smirk still there. He wasn't rushing Starmer, he was giving him rope. Every second of silence was another moment of weakness displayed for the entire nation. Starmer began his response, and you could hear the lawyer in him scrambling for footing. He talked about inherited problems, about complex systems, about long-term strategies that wouldn't show results immediately. Every word made it worse because the British public has heard these excuses before. They've heard every variation of "it's not my fault" and "give us more time" from every politician who's ever broken a promise. And Starmer knew they knew. You could see it in his face. The realisation that this moment would define him, that this would be the clip played endlessly, the soundbite that would haunt him. But Farage wasn't done. As Starmer's explanation wound down, desperate and unconvincing, Farage rose again for a supplementary question. This time he brought receipts. Video clips don't play in Parliament, but Farage didn't need them. He quoted Starmer directly, word for word, from speeches made just months earlier. Promises about specific numerical targets, commitments with deadlines, and then, with devastating effect, he contrasted each promise with the actual figure from that morning's leak. The math was simple, the failure was undeniable, and every MP in that chamber, regardless of party, knew they were witnessing a political execution. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Within minutes, the exchange was trending on every social media platform. News channels interrupted their regular programming to show the clip. Political commentators, many of whom had spent years dismissing Farage as a fringe figure, had to admit he'd just delivered one of the most effective parliamentary demolitions in recent memory. The clip had everything: drama, clear stakes, a visible impact on the target. Starmer's team scrambled into damage control mode, issuing statements about context and complexity, but it was too late. The moment had escaped them. In modern politics, the first impression is often the only impression that matters, and that first impression was of a Prime Minister caught completely off guard, unable to defend his own record. What made it worse for Starmer was that this wasn't some fringe issue that would blow over in a news cycle. Immigration is the issue in British politics right now. It cuts across every traditional party line. It dominates focus groups. It determines elections. Starmer knew this, which is precisely why he tried so hard to neutralise it as a vulnerability. He'd adopted tougher rhetoric, distanced himself from the open border associations that had plagued previous Labour leaders, and made specific, measurable promises. And Farage had just proven in front of the entire country that none of it was real, that it was all positioning, all rhetoric, all politics without substance. The beauty of Farage's strategy was that he'd forced Starmer into an impossible position. If Starmer admitted the figures were accurate but tried to excuse them, he looked weak and dishonest. If he challenged the figures, he'd be fact-checked within hours and proven wrong, making him look both weak and stupid. If he attacked Farage personally, he'd look defensive and desperate, exactly the kind of politician he'd promised not to be. There was no good move. Every response made things worse. This is what political mastery looks like, not having the best policies or the most inspiring vision, but understanding the game at such a fundamental level that you can create situations where your opponent cannot win. Government backbenchers began briefing journalists anonymously within the hour. They didn't defend Starmer. They couldn't. Instead, they tried to shift blame to advisors, to the previous administration, to anyone but the Prime Minister himself. But that strategy backfired too, because it made Starmer look like a man who couldn't control his own government. If his own MPs wouldn't defend him, why should voters? The opposition, sensing opportunity, piled on. Questions were submitted for the next Prime Minister's questions. Committees announced investigations. The policy failure was bad enough, but the political damage was catastrophic. Farage, meanwhile, played it perfectly. He didn't gloat. He didn't do victory laps on television. He simply released a brief statement saying he'd asked legitimate questions that the public deserved answers to, and that he hoped the Prime Minister would provide those answers soon. The restraint was strategic by not rubbing salt in the wound. He looked statesmanlike, serious, focused on issues rather than personal attacks. It was a calculated move designed to contrast with Starmer's obvious discomfort and the chaos of the government's response. Farage understood that when your opponent is drowning, you don't need to push them under. You just need to stand on the shore looking concerned. The leaked figures themselves had become a secondary scandal. How did Farage get them hours before the official release? Who was his source? Was someone inside the government actively working against the Prime Minister? These questions swirled through Westminster's corridors, adding another layer of crisis to an already disastrous situation. Starmer's team launched an investigation into the leak, but that just made them look paranoid and controlling. They were hemorrhaging on multiple fronts: the policy failure, the broken promises, the parliamentary humiliation, and now questions about internal loyalty. Each problem fed into the others, creating a narrative of incompetence and dysfunction. Political analysts began comparing the moment to other famous parliamentary ambushes. Margaret Thatcher's destruction of the Labour leader over defence policy, Tony Blair's dismantling of William Hague on Europe. These were the moments that defined eras, that shifted power balances, that ended careers. And now Starmer's name was being added to that list, not as the victor, but as the victim. For a man who'd built his reputation on never losing an argument, on always being the smartest person in the room, it was a devastating reversal. His entire brand was built on competence and integrity, and in less than 5 minutes, Farage had demolished both. The timing couldn't have been worse for Starmer. Local elections were approaching. The government was already facing criticism on multiple fronts. The economy, healthcare, energy policy. This immigration debacle gave all those disconnected concerns a unifying narrative. Here was a Prime Minister who couldn't deliver on his promises, who said one thing and did another, who blamed others rather than taking responsibility. It was exactly the kind of broad-stroke characterisation that destroys political careers, and Farage had gift-wrapped it for the opposition and the media. What really stung was that Starmer had walked right into it. His advisers would have known the figures were coming. They should have prepared him for questions. They should have had a communication strategy ready. But they'd clearly underestimated Farage. Dismissed him as yesterday's man fighting yesterday's battles. They'd forgotten that Farage had done the impossible before. He'd dragged Britain out of the European Union against every expert prediction, every establishment warning, every poll that said it couldn't be done. Underestimating him was a rookie mistake, and Starmer wasn't supposed to make rookie mistakes. The days following the ambush revealed just how deep the damage went. Poll numbers started shifting. Not dramatically overnight, but steadily, consistently in the wrong direction for Starmer. His personal approval ratings dropped. The government's competence ratings dropped. Most significantly, on the specific question of who voters trusted to handle immigration, Starmer's numbers collapsed. Farage's Reform UK party, meanwhile, saw a surge in support. Donations increased. Membership applications spiked. The political landscape was shifting, and that single parliamentary exchange was the catalyst. Inside Number 10, the mood was grim. Staff members described a Prime Minister who oscillated between frustration and determination, angry at his team for not preparing him better, but also recognising he bore ultimate responsibility. Emergency strategy sessions were convened. Should they double down on immigration promises? Would that just invite more scrutiny they couldn't withstand? Should they pivot to other issues? Would that look like running away? Should they attack Farage personally? Would that elevate him further and make Starmer look petty? Every option seemed fraught with risk. The media coverage was relentless. Newspapers that had supported Starmer during the election now questioned whether he had the political instincts needed for the job. Television panels dissected every aspect of his response, or lack thereof. Social media was even more brutal, with endless memes and clips showing the exact moment his expression changed when Farage dropped the numbers. The image of a confident Prime Minister had been replaced by the image of a man caught red-handed, and images matter more than policy papers in modern politics. Conservative MPs, still bitter about their election defeat, seized the opportunity to criticise Starmer from the opposition benches. They'd been searching for an effective attack line since losing power, and Farage had handed them one on a silver platter. Suddenly they were all immigration hawks, all shocked by the failures, all demanding accountability. The irony that many of them had presided over similar failures when in government was lost in the noise. Politics isn't about consistency. It's about opportunity, and this was an opportunity none of them would pass up. Farage's own position strengthened considerably. He'd been trying to position Reform UK as a legitimate party of government rather than just a protest vehicle. This moment helped that transformation. He'd shown he could operate effectively within the parliamentary system, that he understood how to use its procedures and traditions to maximum effect. He wasn't just the outsider throwing rocks anymore. He was a serious political operator who could compete on equal terms with establishment figures and win. That evolution was crucial for his long-term ambitions. The business community started paying attention too. Corporate leaders who dismissed Farage as a populist troublemaker began reconsidering. If he could dominate Parliament like this, if he could shift public opinion so effectively, he couldn't be ignored. Meetings were arranged. Doors that had been closed started opening. Money that had flowed exclusively to establishment parties started finding new directions. Farage was becoming, for perhaps the first time in his career, truly respectable in the eyes of the power brokers who matter most in British politics. For Starmer, the crisis forced a reckoning. He'd spent his career in controlled environments, courtrooms where rules governed proceedings, or Labour Party politics where he'd methodically eliminated rivals and consolidated power. Parliament was different. It was chaotic, unpredictable, gladiatorial, and he just learnt that lesson the hard way. His team pushed him to be more aggressive, more willing to take risks, less concerned with always appearing reasonable and measured. But that advice cut against every instinct Starmer had. He'd won the Labour leadership precisely by being the anti-chaos candidate, the serious grown-up in contrast to his predecessor's unpredictability. The policy question remained unresolved. The immigration figures were real. They weren't going to improve quickly. Any honest assessment suggested they might get worse before they got better, if they got better at all. The systems were broken, the backlogs were enormous, and the geopolitical pressures driving migration weren't going away. Starmer could make different promises, but he couldn't change reality. And every day that passed without improvement was another day Farage could point to the failure, another day the government looked incompetent, another day voters who'd given Starmer a chance reconsidered that decision. International implications started emerging too. European leaders who'd hoped Starmer would represent a return to stable, cooperative British politics began worrying. If he couldn't handle domestic criticism, if his government looked this weak this early, he wouldn't be an effective partner in negotiations. American officials, always attentive to British political stability, started hedge their bets, reaching out to opposition figures to maintain relationships in case the government fell. Diplomacy abhors a vacuum, and Starmer's diminished authority created exactly that kind of vacuum.